before we begin.
Okay, Marlene's going to do some introductory announcements, and then we will have our America 250 presentation with Lee Edwards. And then we will start off with the presentation by Kate Townsend, which I'm very much looking forward to seeing. So here we go. Marlene, come on.
Few little,
You need to be here.
okay, just a few little housekeeping announcements. And that is, I see everybody has their name tags. So if you didn't get your name tag with the lanyard, if you're a member, then you get this and you get to keep it and use it for every meeting you have. We only have a limited number of lanyards, so if you forget it for one meeting, just take a sticky name tag and wear it for that meeting. But I just usually keep mine in the side console door of the car, so I know where it is. And then we welcome all the non-members. Use the sticky tab so we can identify you. And we welcome all of you here and hope that eventually you'll join us. Other than that, I want to thank all of the people that brought the wonderful breakfast foods. And we are looking for people to help out with the coffees and the hot water and that. I'm doing, I think, too much. So I do need some help with that for each month. So if you want to sign up, I can give you the coffee container. You can take that home and bring it for the next meeting or whatever. So thank you and appreciate everybody that's volunteered and hopes in the future that you'll volunteer. Thank you.
Thanks. And in terms of stealth volunteers, I want to give a thanks to Amy Breedlove. We worked together for a day or so, and then she worked on her own for quite a while to get our website fixed up. And we picked the research page and the research aids, and all of the links and all of that have been updated so that they should all work. And if you are looking for links, consider going to our website and look for research aids under research. And with that, I'm going to turn this over to Lee so that she can do her America at 250 presentation. And then, are you the introducer for this behavior? Okay. Well, come along.
Okay, so many of you have seen our America 250. Am I close enough?
A little close.
Closer. Is that better?
Yeah.
That's better. I can hear.
And the people that listen at home later from Zoom are going to appreciate that.
Thank you. So you've seen that starting this back in September, we've been trying to prime the pump and urge people to send in little blurbs about their ancestors. And it can be ancestors from the Revolutionary War period, or really any major event in our American history. And you don't have to present it up front like I'm doing. You can just send it to the newsletter or summarize one day on even artifacts. Like Fran was just telling me she has a certificate that she could bring in and tell 2 or 3 sentences about it and put it in the back and show it. And then I think you had Marie Withrow's quilt one day. So it can be an artifact or a little article or whatever. So I'm going to talk about my 5th great-grandfather, Thomas Edwards. So this is my direct line on the Edwards side. And probably the most, it's pretty typical, a story, but probably what is most interesting are the pictures at the bottom. And I put some of these around, so pass them around, because on the left is my 2nd great-grandfather, John Garland Maine Edwards, then my grandfather, Thomas Randolph Edwards, and then my grandfather, Walter M. Edwards Sr., and my father, Walter M. Edwards Jr., and the pictures are probably the most fun to look at. And I do favor my father in terms of the pictures. So take a quick look at those thumbnails. But basically, Thomas came in, he was born in 1730, and he immigrated. There were about 3 or 4 generations before him who came into Virginia. He was in Henrico County, And gradually he moved, he moved up the James River, and then his family moved west along the border with Virginia, with North Carolina. His ancestors, of course, came from Wales. He was a landowner and farmer, and he grew his wealth by acquiring land. He was a surveyor for a little while. He had his name shows up on some land records in Virginia, and he has a deed. I think that's what it says here. He has a deed that was signed by Thomas Jefferson at one point. Now his son migrated to Georgia, and probably they used the Great Wagon Road. So I mean, I don't know, but that was the typical route, because where they were in Pennsylvania County, the wagon road almost went through there, and then to Augusta, Georgia, and they went just a little bit further on to the Athens area and Oglethorpe County. So there were 4 more generations of Edwardses that lived in Oglethorpe County, which I don't think my father ever really knew about. And it turned out that my father and my mother met at the University of Georgia. So there's this whole, progression. So that's not an unusual story, but I offered to present it and enjoy the photos. Thank you. Yes. There's 3 or 4 major roadways that were Indian, the Native American pathways, and they gradually expanded. There's, of course, one that goes down the coastline. There's one a little bit further west that goes down the fall line, the Piedmont, the fall line. And then there's this Great Wagon Road, which really starts in the Philadelphia area, goes through Lancaster and kind of curves down and goes through the Shenandoah Valley and ends up in North Carolina. And then it's the extensions that go into Georgia. So that's the,
That sounds like a great article.
All right, we'll work on that. There's is it Dunleavy? Somebody correct me. William Dunleavy, who's written, is that right? Who's written a series, what? Dollarhide. Okay, Dollarhide, thank you. Who's written little books on this, and they're terrific, and you can get them on Amazon and all. I got one about several years ago, and it explained several migration paths for my ancestors. Good question, thank you. Oh, yes, okay. Marlene says they're in the Virginia room. Very good. All right, I want to switch and introduce Kate. This is Kate Townsend, our speaker for today. And Kate is a former professional investigator turned genealogist, specializing in Pennsylvania genealogical research. She also has experience with records from Ohio, West Virginia, and New York City, as well as expertise in immigration, naturalization, and court records. She previously served as the vice chair, and immediate past chair of the National Genealogical Society Delegate Council. She holds the Certified Genealogist credential as of February 2024. She has spoken at genealogy societies, libraries, conferences, in particular, the National Genealogical Society Family History Conference. And so with that, I have really enjoyed getting to know some of our speakers, just because I've been doing the emails back and forth and making sure they knew where to go and and so forth. But I'm really pleased, Kate is going to do the first part, a lecture, and then she has an activity for the after the break. And she's got all these wonderful flow charts. So she's hopefully making a difficult topic a little easier for us. Okay, Kate.
Thank you guys so much for having me. It's nice to be here in Virginia. I went to high school and college in DC. So it's also nice to see that the Silver Line was finally completed, because I felt like that was a pipe dream when I first moved here. Today we're going to be talking about one of my favorite subjects, and that's immigrant ancestor records that you can identify for your ancestors. This is a subject that is very complicated. That's why there are flowcharts that we'll be working with later that are very small with handwriting on them. However, I do have larger versions of the flowcharts, and then you guys should all receive digital copies that I assure you are much easier to read. We'll be doing an activity with those later. I do want to say about this topic is I like to give this lecture because I think a lot of people don't know all the types of records that you can get for your immigrant ancestors, particularly if they immigrated in the 20th century. I feel like these are underutilized and underknown about in the genealogy world. But it's the type of subject that you can spend a week talking about this. And I actually did that. If you guys are familiar with the Genealogical Research Institute of Pittsburgh, about 5 years ago, I took a class with a gentleman called Rich Venezia, and then Marion Smith, who was a historian for the INS, which turned into USCIS, about these type of records. So we can spend a lot of time on this subject, but what I really hope that you all gain with this lecture is knowing starting points for other types of resources that you can get for your immigrant ancestors. So with that, let's get started. Sorry, I heard a little bit of feedback. So our agenda for today is we're going to discuss incoming and outgoing passenger lists, the laws that were associated with them, what you might identify and when associated with those records. We're going to talk about naturalization records, which can be a really complicated subject and actuality because it depended on the law at the time. Okay.
Let's see if that holds it.
All right. So naturalization depended on the law at the time and might vary what race an individual was and whether they were male or female. So we'll get into that a little bit. And then the one thing that I think a lot of people aren't familiar with is these USCIS genealogy program records, some of which have been transferred to the National Archives and Records Administration. And those are something I want to get on your radar and show you what you might be able to obtain from those record sources. So the first thing, and something that you're probably familiar with, are those incoming and outgoing passenger list records. So incoming passenger list records, those are the records for when immigrants arrive in a country or a port of entry. Those are not exclusive to the United States. We're going to be talking about some foreign incoming passenger list records in a couple of slides. But in the United States, common ports of entry for immigrants, particularly if you have ancestors here in Virginia, would be Baltimore, Boston, New York, Philadelphia, and more. Some ancestors arrived at the port of New Orleans and traveled up the Mississippi River. There's also passenger list records for individuals arriving from Asia, typically in San Francisco. Another thing that I want to point out is some immigrants might have also come to the United States via Canada due to cost. It was a lot cheaper for immigrants to come through Canada than through the US. And at some points, 40% of immigrants actually arrived in Canada and then came to the United States after that. But there's a caveat with these Canadian records. Until 1894, there was really no coordination between the Canadian government and the United States government for immigration, meaning someone could arrive in Canada and say they were going to the US, and nobody in Canada would record them as arriving in Canada. And then they could just cross the border and they wouldn't be recorded there either. So if you're not identifying someone prior to 1894, it could be that they came through Canada at one point. After 1894, there were border crossing records, and there's also something called the St. Albans list, where there were actually U.S. immigration officers stationed in Canada, actually in St. Albans, Vermont, but they would go over Canada. That's why it's called the St. Albans list, and would record those individuals saying they were going to the U.S. eventually. But if someone said that they were going to Canada and perhaps lied, they would still be recorded by Canadian immigration at the time, even starting before that 1894, if they lived in Canada for a while before they came into the US. but it's just a caveat that a lot of people don't know about. And the reason, besides the cost that people came through Canada, was actually that the Canadian requirements were less stringent for inspection purposes than here in the United States. So now we're going to talk about incoming passenger list records here in the United States and the law. So from 1789 to 1819, passenger lists were not required. And it really varies whether anything was recorded at all. And it can be difficult to find these records. I feel like a lot of people get disappointed because they want to find a passenger list record when their early immigrant ancestor arrived during this time, but it's really difficult to do so. Some ports, like the Port of Philadelphia, did record passengers, but a caveat with that is they didn't record passengers if they came from what is now the United Kingdom and Ireland. They would only record continental Europeans, so you're probably not going to find a record from that time period. Now, in 1820 to 1891, we had the passage of something called the Steerage Act of 1819, which required that a manifest with limited information be recorded. So that would be the passenger's name, their sex, their occupation. And we're going to see some examples, and you've probably seen some of these examples before, but they might say everybody on one manifest was a laborer. So it doesn't give us a lot of information if everyone is just a laborer. The country of origin. Now, this was more to abide by customs law than anything else. It wasn't really about immigration so much as making sure that everyone had enough provisions on board when they made that cross over the Atlantic. So from 1891 and after, that's when we get our first real immigration laws. So we have the Immigration Act of 1891, and that required that passengers really be inspected upon arrival at all ports. And manifests with more robust information were kept for the first time. So you might have questions. And this also evolved over time, like what's your final destination? How much money do you have on you? Who were you joining in the United States? And early in the 20th century, a lot of immigrants sort of boomeranged from the US, going back to their home country after saving some money to get more people and coming back again. And it might actually ask, have you been in the United States before? If so, when and where? Now, not all passengers were actually inspected. I think it's really interesting to note in the 1890s, if you had an ancestor who was wealthy enough to travel second and first class, they did not inspect these passengers at the Port of New York, at the very least. That's something that Marianne Smith, who was the historian for USCIS, told me, and it was something I had seen reflected in my own research, but it was almost like these passengers, if they're wealthy enough to travel second and first class, they're probably not going to be what was called a public charge. So someone who would like drain the system here, and they're probably not going to have disease. So then 2 years after this Immigration Act of 1891, we now have the Immigration Act of 1893. And this created something called the Board of Special Inquiry, as well as some other updates. The Board of Special Inquiry was if you've heard people were detained upon arrival at Ellis Island, it's probably because of the Board of Special Inquiry, where they were inspecting passengers for disease, whether they would be a public charge, wanting to make sure that they had money to get to their final destination. And these records, if they are for the Port of New York, we're going to see an example of how they're actually at the end of a passenger manifest and how to identify those records. If they're at another port, those records are typically at the National Archives. So for Philadelphia, it's the National Archives at Philadelphia, and they are, paper physical records. So another thing we're going to talk about is those international incoming passenger lists, because incoming passenger lists are not just exclusive to the United States. So if you're looking for somebody coming to the US or even going elsewhere, you might want to check those Canadian incoming passenger list records. So although people who were US bound weren't necessarily recorded until 1894, there are other passenger lists for people who did live in Canada for a time before coming to the United States. And there's also UK and Ireland incoming passenger lists from 1878 to 1960. So sometimes our ancestors did go back to where they came from. And sometimes you can find them on these UK and Ireland incoming passenger lists. So this is a rarity, but something to just have on your radar that it might be worth a search on one of these record collections. So similar to those foreign incoming passenger lists, we also have outgoing passenger lists for when immigrants left a country or a port of entry. Now, these lists were not kept, at every port, and they're not comprehensive anywhere. But there are some good collections on Ancestry.com, like the Hamburg passenger lists for a lot of immigrants who left from Germany, who perhaps were also from Eastern Europe. There's also UK and Ireland outward passenger lists from 1890 to 1960. It was a lot cheaper at one point to travel out of the UK to go to the United States, but you did have to live in the UK for 6 weeks prior to doing so. So at this time, a lot of people did travel out of the United Kingdom to come to the United States. So I find it helpful to still check these passenger lists and information fields because they can vary from the incoming passenger list. So an example of this would be that you identify that an ancestor arrived in the United States in 1904. They left from the port of Liverpool, but you're seeing that they arrived in New York. I would also go to the UK and Ireland passenger list records and that collection to see if you can find that record of their outbound journey from the UK to the United States. So there would be almost like 2 corresponding passenger lists for the same ship. So some ways to identify these records, there are numerous passenger list collections on Ancestry and Family Search. You might also want to try searching on websites like Ellis Island or MyHeritage. If you're having trouble finding someone, I would get creative with your searches. If you're familiar with wildcards or Boolean operators, I Google like Ancestry.com, or they don't have Boolean operators, wildcards, to see what I can come up with to help guide my searches. I've even asked ChatGPT to put together the wildcard searches for certain last names for me, and that's actually worked quite well. Little bit of tangent is ChatGPT. I've even asked, I've seen this name variation for what I believe is a Croatian last name. Can you help me identify what the surname would be in Croatian? And it's actually successfully done that for me, which has been very helpful. So that's one way to use AI for genealogy. And another thing is to go to the microfilm and SoundX if all else fails, particularly for those like Canadian passenger lists. Not all of those are digitized online, like those St. Albans passenger lists. And you guys are lucky enough to live here in the Washington, D.C. area. So if all else fails, I would go to the National Archives, like by the Navy Memorial, like the Archives 1, and look at the microfilm there. Because I've done that before to try to identify people who came through Canada, or even if they came in the US, to look at the Soundex online. Because these passenger list records were originally on paper, and then they were microfilmed. The paper was destroyed. So the most original essence of these records that we have is the microfilm. So then the microfilm goes to like Family Search or Ancestry or MyHeritage. And I've seen examples where they're like sheets of a passenger manifest missing on Ancestry, but it's on Family Search. So that's why it's helpful to look at all the different websites, but that's also why the microfilm is like the most original, resource for these records. So now we're going to look at some examples of passenger lists. This is one from 1820 to 1891, where we just have limited information. So this is for Ellen Friel, and who I believe was her mother, also named Ellen Friel. And they're arriving in 1870 from Ireland. They don't have an occupation. They're just going to America, and they're in steerage. So it's not very helpful when you see something like this, where it just says America and you don't know where exactly in America they're going to. Because I feel like the clerks got a little lazy and it was just like Ireland, America, and then the dot to signify everyone else was the same. This is often what you're going to get pre-1893 when we had that first really comprehensive immigration legislation. However, that's not true for every single port. Some ports, like the Port of Baltimore, actually did record more robust information. So don't think you're never going to find something, but it is possible. So for this guy here, John Henry Heckman, he's listed on this passenger list record from 1852, so quite early on, as J.H. Heckman. We have his age there, but the key thing here is we have his actual town of origin, which was Heinbeck in Germany. The reason why this is great is if you'll see that it was Heinbeck for the guy above him and Heinbeck for John Henry Heckman belowhand. And these two guys actually traveled to the United States together. And I knew that they had like a close friendship because I had some family records. This is not my not my family, but family letters that talked about these two families. But you can see this in the passenger list records where it makes it clear because these two guys are traveling from the same town in Germany. So it's great to have that information, particularly this early on. And instead of just classifying them both as laborers, we see that John Henry Heckman is a saddler and his companion is a farmer. And that both of these guys were traveling to Pennsylvania. So we don't have the town in Pennsylvania, but it narrows it down more than just saying America or United States for their final destination. Now we're going to look at a foreign outgoing passenger list. So after 1891, and this is for this guy here called Kost Kasherba. So this is, and these Hamburg passenger lists, it's not like the UK where it's in English. These are in German, but you can always, Google Translate what the top part says, but it could give you some more information. So for Kost Kasherba, it has his town of origin, his age, and he's going to New York. So this is on the Hamburg side, what they recorded there. And he's on the ship called the President Lincoln. And he's leaving on the 21st of October in 1911. So then I see this record, and then I can find the corresponding incoming passenger list or do the inverse with these two. So on this incoming passenger list, he's arriving in New York, again on the President Lincoln. And he arrived on October 20th. I think it was the 12th on the other page. So, we have like those two manifests that sort of correspond to each other. Now, an example of the Board of Special Inquiry, and I did mention that if somebody arrived in the Port of New York, these are at the end of the manifest. So what I mean by that is if you're on microfilm or on ancestry.com, the Port of New York, you can scroll to the end. The reason why somebody was detained by the Board of Special Inquiry is just because of the check mark. It might be an X, a check mark, a stamp that says detained. It could also be if somebody was hospitalized, there might be hospitalized, detained, or something next to their name. And in this case, it's just an X. So a small notation indicates that they were detained. So again, as I mentioned, New York, you can find these at the end of the manifesto. Scroll to the end, whether it's on Ancestry, Family Search, etc., because often these records will have one name on the passenger manifest and another name that's completely spelled different on the Board of Special Inquiry records. And I'll show you a trick on how to make sure that you found the right person, but it's often these don't populate when you find a passenger manifest. Any other port is going to be the same notation, but Philadelphia, those records, again, on paper at the National Archives in Philadelphia. Boston, I believe it's the same thing. So anyways, Kost Kasherba has an X next to his name, so he was detained. So what do? I scroll to the end of the passenger manifest on Ancestry, and I find this record where it says records of detained aliens. His name is spelled different. It's Kata, period, Kasherba, and the surname is spelled different. And then next to the him, we have there's a page, a group number, and a line number. And that corresponds to where his name was on the passenger manifest. So if we go back to the passenger manifest, this is 3 and 3 here, that he was on like the third group here, the third line. So if you see a board for special inquiry record for your ancestor, you see like that X or hospitalization or something, go to the end of the manifest and line those numbers up to make sure you have the right individual. So back to the record itself. This says his cause of detention was he didn't have money. It's just like telegram money. He needed someone to send him money. So he didn't have money to his final destination. This is my husband's great uncle. Apparently wasn't the best guy. So when I showed this record to my father-in-law, he was like, of course he was detained and didn't have money and had to talk to my grandfather to give him money. So it lists Anna Firka Sherba at Forbes Road, which is where he lived. And that's who he was getting money from. One other detail, you'll see meals and dates of discharge. So you'll see how many breakfast, lunches, and dinners that they had when they were detained. And you can sort of make an inference from how long they were detained for. But there's also like a date and time for when they were discharged, which is next to what I've highlighted there to find out when they were discharged and compare that to when they arrived in port. So our last example with these passenger list records is going to be a foreign incoming passenger list. So this is for this guy, Harry Townsend. This is my great-great-grandfather who was a criminal, and he sort of fled the United States at various points. But this is him going back to his native United Kingdom in 1893. And he actually had a lot of money. So he was somebody who would travel second class. So he wasn't recorded coming into the United States, but he was recorded going from the United States to the United Kingdom. And that's a record of this. And it has like some information here, like his age, his occupation as a puddler, which was a type of steel worker. He lived in Pittsburgh when he was in the United States. So we have more detail on these records than some of those, earlier US records, but a lot of times it would just say like farmer or laborer. So now that we've talked about passenger list records, we're now going to talk about naturalization. So what is naturalization? So it's just the legal process to become a citizen of a country when you're an immigrant. Now, generally, and there are a lot of caveats to this, it was a two-step process for our ancestors prior to 1956, that you would file something called a declaration of intention. And the amount of years that you could file this after residing in the United States and everything, it changed and morphed. And then you can file a petition for naturalization. That's actually like the legal document where you petition a court to become a United States citizen. The declaration of intention was also filed in court. Again, caveats that there's issues with naturalization and race, meaning not everyone could always naturalize in the United States based on their race. So from 1790 onward, any free white person could file for naturalization, but it wasn't until 1870 that individuals with African descent could naturalize or were automatically naturalized when they were born in the United States. And it wasn't until 1924 that Native Americans received United States citizenship. And it wasn't until 1952 that Asians and other races could naturalize for the first time. But prior to 1902, Latinos could naturalize in some cases, particularly if they were Mexican, of Mexican descent. After the Mexican-American War, there was a treaty that, they could naturalize. So it's just some things to keep in mind if you have any ancestors that were people of color. So prior to what we call the Naturalization Act of 1906, there was limited standardization for the process. So a couple of things. You could file for naturalization in any court in the United States. So a federal court or a small court or some random court, like in Pennsylvania, we had something called the Quarter Sessions Court that dealt with anything from commitments to murder. You could file for naturalization in any court. And it's very typical to see someone file forms in different courts. So say they arrived in the United States, lived in Broome County, New York, and then moved to Montgomery County, Maryland. You might see them file their declaration of intention for naturalization in New York State and Broome County, and then file for their petition for naturalization in Montgomery County, Maryland. There were also no standardized forms, which the Naturalization Act of 1906 corrected. And because of this, the amount of information on the forms really varies. So sometimes they might just ask for the name and the country that they originated from. Sometimes you might get age or, the port of entry prior to 1906, but it really, really varied. So with that 1906 Basic Naturalization Act, naturalization became a standardized process across the United States for the first time. And there were standard forms for naturalization, which would evolve and have, different things that they would now want. So eventually they would want a picture for the Declaration of Intention in the 1920s, but that wasn't required when the Basic Naturalization Act was passed. So this sort of morphed over time. Individuals were encouraged to file for naturalization in federal court. They wanted it to be a federal process, but that didn't always happen. So after 1906, you might want to check the federal court first, but if your ancestor lived in a rural part of Virginia or Maryland, they might have actually naturalized in a local county court still. Now, a declaration of intention was only required until 1952, and then that requirement was eliminated after 1956. And there's still some situations prior to 1952 where your ancestor might not have needed a declaration of intention for naturalization. And we'll talk about some of those examples. And another thing is declaration of intentions expired after 7 years after 1906. So you might actually identify your ancestor filed more than one declaration of intention of naturalization. So they filed in 1910, and then they decided they wanted to become a citizen again in 1922. So they filed the declaration of intention for 1922, and then a petition for naturalization, say in 1926. Okay. These are in the wrong order. Okay. So now we're going to talk about the Expatriation Act of 1902. There's a delay. So citizenship was tied to the status of a husband, like the legal status for women. So if you married someone who was not a United States citizen and you were born in this country, you could actually lose your citizenship, which was crazy. And if you were, foreign born and married an American citizen, you would automatically become a United States citizen. So this wasn't a very good practice because natural born American women could lose their citizenship. And the Cable Act of 1922 ended this practice. And it also made it so that women could naturalize and become citizens on their own, because a lot of times prior to this time, women legally could before the Expatriation Act, but they just didn't do it. And another thing is one of those situations, rare situations, where somebody's not going to have a declaration of intention is if this woman was naturalizing and their husband was already a U.S. citizen, they didn't need to file a declaration of intention for naturalization. So how do we identify these naturalization records? So since prior to 1906, it's complicated. You could file naturalization in any court in the United States. It is also tricky to find these records. So I would suggest looking for all the courts and the jurisdiction on where your ancestor lived. So I would look to see what courts existed at the time, because courts can morph. So whether you look at a city directory or the Library of Congress does have a really good guide for the courts in different states. If you Google that and just go court by court to look for these records is probably your best bet. Now, another thing is, some courts might not exist anymore. So that's why you really want to Google to find out what courts existed at the time that your ancestor naturalized. So post 1906, naturalization is supposed to be filed federally. So if your ancestor lived in like an urban area, I would suggest just looking federally as like your first bet. However, again, in some rural locations, those naturalization records can still be processed by county courts at that time, really until like the 1950s. So some places where these records might be. So if it's federal, a lot of that's on Fold 3 or at the National Archives. If it's prior to 1906, especially, these records still might be in a county courthouse, or they could be digitized on a county website. Online databases like Ancestry, Family Search, or Fold 3 have copies of these collections, but they're not necessarily comprehensive. You really need to search for what is in a particular collection and what dates they cover. Your local historical society might have copies of the records, a state archive, the National Archives and Records Administration, and then browsable images / full text search on Family Search. You can search for someone's name and like petition for naturalization now to see if you can find the record there. So now we're going to look at some examples. So this is a declaration of intention for naturalization prior to 1906. This is for someone who filed for naturalization in Fayette County, Pennsylvania. And this doesn't have that much information about him. It just says that this guy was renouncing Italy, doesn't specify where in Italy. This is from 1903. So before we had more standardization with naturalization for the first time, and we don't have much information. This is what you're typically going to see. Now, this is another record here for this guy, Henry Herberth. He naturalizes in Allegheny County, Pennsylvania. And we do get the region of Germany where he's from. Sometimes you'll see a region in Germany or a county in Ireland on these records. This is from 1855, but again, not a lot of detail. This one here is, again, it shows the county in Ireland, and it also says that he arrived at the port of Philadelphia on the 18th of April in 1852. So this was filed, or no. Yeah, this was filed later in 1860. My citation was incorrect. Sorry, guys. Anyway, so this has information about when somebody arrived in the United States. So this is rare, but it's definitely possible. Now we're going to talk about something just because I think this is super interesting. And it's a declaration of intention prior to 1906 was something called an alien registration. So there was a Naturalization Act in 1798 that mandated that aliens coming to the US needed to register at a court that they were, born abroad, list their place of birth, etc. In 1816, this was put into law that you needed to provide this documentation when you naturalized. And this only existed from 1816 to 1828. Most of the records were destroyed, but in some rare instances where court clerks were very meticulous, you might find something like this, which is an alien registration report that was attached to someone's naturalization document, which is an incredible record because it lists this guy, Thomas Robinson, and all of his family members in his household, like his children, and their exact places of birth and their ages. So if you see something like this, it's not actually part of like a declaration of intention or a petition naturalization. It's a separate document that's an alien registration. Because when we look at the corresponding petition for naturalization for this guy, it's very akin to what was asked for at the time. So now we're going to look at a petition for naturalization before 1906. So again, this is for the guy, Tony Politano. We looked at his record before, and really there's not that much information, just Italy, the individuals who were the witnesses for him, and we don't have a lot of information there. Now, we talked about how sometimes people didn't need to file a declaration of intention for naturalization. So like the women after 1922 who were married to United States citizens. There was also provision if you came to the United States before the age of 21, you could naturalize without a declaration of intention. But if you came to the United States before 1795 and you naturalized, you didn't have to file a declaration of intention. So for this individual here, it says unnecessary for the declaration of intention. I know it's hard to read for all of those individuals because presumably they arrived before 1795. And then their corresponding petition for naturalization looks very similar, where we have the name of the individual, they're renouncing citizenship from Ireland, and a witness and the signature of the court clerk. So after 1906 and after, I believe it's 1928, where there's photos, these records get a lot more interesting. So this is a record for a guy, Louis de Teselo. We have a great photo of him on his declaration of intention for naturalization. We have information about when he arrived in the United States, all of his children's names, dates of birth, and when they were born, where he originated from, in Serbia, his occupation, address, etc. So this is when these records get really like fun and interesting because they have more robust information for the first time. And a petition for naturalization after 1906. This one is for the same guy, Louis Atezolo. It doesn't have a photo for the actual petition for naturalization. And a lot of the information is what we had on the Declaration of Intention for Naturalization, but we have those great details like the name of the children, occupation, etc. And this is where we have standardized forms. So this guy actually naturalized in a county court in Westmoreland County, Pennsylvania, not in federal court after 1906, but the form that he used would have been the same form that someone would have used to naturalize in federal court because the forms were standardized. So now we're going to talk about USCIS records and beyond, because some of these records have now been accessioned to the National Archives. This is the part of the lecture where I think a lot of people might not have some familiarity with these records, and they're interesting to obtain. And I think, you know, if you have particularly a 20th century ancestor, these are something that should be on your radar and pursue. So the first type of record is we're going to talk about a certificate file record, which is often abbreviated as a C file. So that Basic Naturalization Act of 1906 that we've talked about also implemented the creation of a standardized certificate of citizenship. So before that time, you would naturalize, and like your county court or even a federal court, you file that petition for naturalization and you're given a certificate of citizenship to prove that you were a US citizen. But the problem was that the court didn't keep a copy of that record and the federal government didn't keep a copy of that record. So if someone lost their certificate of citizenship, perhaps they could get a replacement, but it wasn't a standardized process. So what the Basic Naturalization Act did is it created a file for each immigrant where a copy of your certificate of citizenship would be sent to the INS, which is now USCIS, correspondence for your naturalization, and copies of your Declaration of Intention for Naturalization or your petition for naturalization, So for individuals who naturalized from September 27, 1906 to March 31st, 1956, it is possible to request a copy of this file that's called a C file through the USCIS genealogy program. But you have to have something called a certificate number for the immigrant. Now, some of these files will have robust information in them depending on when they naturalized. But for a lot of individuals, they're just going to have that certificate of naturalization. And if they naturalize late enough, there will be a photo on that certificate of naturalization, which is different than what was on their Declaration of Intention for Naturalization. So if you want the photo and the certificate, a copy of the certificate your ancestor had to prove they were a US citizen, it's definitely worth getting. Now, in rare instances, it's possible to have someone who naturalized before 1906 to have a certificate file if they then needed to contact the government to get a copy of their certificate of naturalization. Another reason why that 1906 law was even passed is a lot of people got something called derivative citizenship. So say the husband in a family, like the father, naturalizes. All of his children and his wife would have automatically become US citizens, but they weren't named on those naturalization forms, nor did they get their individual copies of a certificate of naturalization. So people were US citizens, but they had no proof to that fact. So that's also why this law was created, that everyone could get a certificate for naturalization, or like the head of household would get it to prove the citizenship. So post 1906, a certificate number or a C file number should be located on a petition for naturalization. So this is the certificate number for that post 1906 petition for naturalization we looked at for Louis Atezolo, where it's just like on his petition for naturalization. So if it's not on the petition for naturalization for whatever reason, and you're having trouble finding that certificate file, either on a post 1906 naturalization, sorry, there's a lag, or you just want to know whether someone naturalized in general after 1906, I would suggest you conduct something called an index search with USCIS. So you just Google the USCIS genealogy program. There's links in your handout for this too. And you would do an index search request for that individual to find a certificate number and to just see if they naturalized and see what USCIS has on file for them. So you go to where it says index search request, you type in all the information you really have on that immigrant ancestor. There's some really helpful fields to guide you, and you process that request. It costs $30 just to send this to USCIS. It used to be $65, but there were some genealogists who petitioned to have the cost lowered, which is great. Problem is, this takes a really long time to get. It's great when you get it, but all the stuff with USCIS, it takes a long time. Right now, it's about like 8 to 10 months just to get this, like a search for this number, which is crazy. So say you go 8 to 10 months, you get that certificate number and you want to request that certificate file, then you go to record request with case ID because you have a prior case ID where USCIS did something for you. Or if you just found that certificate number on someone's petition for naturalization, you would go record request without search case ID because you haven't done any prior searches on that individual with USCIS. So it takes a lot of time. Each of these searches, 8 to 10 months, sometimes longer. But if you actually get that certificate file and, you know, it surprises you in the mail one day, which could be in the mail. Sometimes you just want to check. I think I have this in the handout, is they will send it to you via CD-ROM, which is really annoying because a lot of computers don't have CD-ROM anymore. So I have like an adapter for one. I accidentally said, send me the stuff via CD-ROM. You can have it sent like print in the mail or emailed, but just to let you know, don't select CD-ROM unless you really want to. Anyway, so we talked about Louis de Teslo, saw his other post-1906 naturalization documents. This is his certificate of naturalization. So it has a photo of him, his signature, and this is what he could use to prove his US citizenship. So it takes a long time. It costs about $60, but it is nice to have if that's something that's important to you. Now, less time consuming than it once was is something called alien registration form records. These records could only request them through USCIS. They've now been accessioned to the National Archives, and the turnaround time is a lot faster. So what was an alien registration form? So we talked about that rare time where there was alien registration from 1816 to 1828. And most of those records have been destroyed, but the ones for an alien registration from August 1940 to March 1944 have survived. So in the run up to World War II, if you weren't a US citizen and you were over the age of 14, you had to register with the government that you were an alien. So these forms contain information like date of birth, place of birth, your citizenship status, and your marital status, your occupation, when you arrived in the United States, etc. How do you find these records? Well, you must have something called an A number for the immigrant ancestor. Now, you can search for this number now through the National Archives' website in an online index, the link to which is in your handout. So it's really great that you can now search these records online, because it used to be that you had to send that request to USCIS, wait 8 to 10 months and find out whether they had a number. Now, if they do have a number in this online index, for most people, and again, there's caveats throughout this lecture, that's why we have flowcharts to guide us, you can email the National Archives, now that they're open again, and you can submit your request to them that you want a copy of somebody's alien registration form, and there's like a nominal fee to get it. Now, again, I did mention the caveats. So sometimes an alien registration form has been consolidated with somebody's A file or C file, which we haven't gone over yet. And I'm probably confusing you already, but we're going to get there. So why do you want this form? Because it's interesting and has some great information if you have a 20th century ancestor. So this is for this guy, Charles Rome, and he was not a good guy. This is his alien registration form. He is not my ancestor, by the way. But it has his name variation, when he came to the United States using, when he arrived in the United States, what his occupation was, where he was born, and it has all of his criminal charges. So 2 for assault and battery. But this is great information for those ancestors who weren't U.S. citizens in 1940 that can help guide you to other records. So if you didn't know when he arrived in the United States, now he could have gotten it wrong too. That's another thing. Immigrants didn't always remember precisely when they arrived, but it'll give you a general time frame and port for when somebody arrived. So now we're going to talk about visa files. So the Immigration Act of 1924, this required that immigrants applied for a visa when coming to the United States for permanent residence for the first time. So visa files contain information similar to what's on like a passenger list record, but there's also supporting documentation and often a photo of the immigrant. There's also correspondence that I want to mention because you guys live in this area at archives too, that there's like State Department files that you could work through with an archivist to get where there is some correspondence through like an embassy in Italy for someone applying for a visa in the United States. So that's something, if you do have 20th century immigrant ancestors, you might want to go to archives too and pursue some of those records. But for the most part, we're just talking about the visa files right now. Now, similar to those other requests through USCIS or even the National Archives, you need to have a visa file number to request this record. So if someone had a visa number, but then naturalized after 1944, this record is either going to be consolidated in the A file, which we're going to talk about, or a consolidated C file. So just keep that in mind. But if someone arrives and naturalizes in this time period, you can get their visa file number. Now, how do you search for visa numbers? I'm going to show you in a few slides, but the only way to do it, even if you don't find something that you think is the visa number, is by going through USCIS and doing that index search request for $30 and then doing a record request with case ID once you wait those 10 agonizing months to get that one number to request the corresponding visa file. So now we're going to look at an example of a visa file. So this is for Pietro Ganaim and Maria Felicetti. Maria Felicetti was the wife of Pietro Ganaim. A lot of Italian women, even if they were married, would travel under their maiden surname. But they're arriving in the United States. Pietro, you'll see there, is a United States citizen. Maria is Italian, and it does say immigration visa number, and there's a number underneath her name, but that's not the visa number that you use to request her file from USCIS. So don't do it. It's not going to work. That's a number that corresponds to something with the State Department, not the number that you actually need. Because when I did do an index search request for Maria Felicetti, I got this visa file number, which is much different than that one on the passenger list record. So this is like the only way to do it. When you do get that record, you have some information. Sometimes they'll redact things. If they think like somebody is alive still that they're mentioned, I don't know why this was redacted because they didn't have children or anything. But there could be some redactions, but you have information about her mother and father. They're addressed, that her father's deceased, but her mother still lives in Ascoli Piceno, and where they're arriving to in the United States. So some great information there. We also have that she's saying that she's a non-quota relative of a United States citizen, because we did get quotas in the 1920s for what immigrants could come into the United States, and that she is providing all of this documentation for her file, like her marriage certificate, her birth certificate, etc. And when I requested a copy of this file, I did get copies of her birth certificate, her marriage certificate, and some other documents from Italy. So it's great to have those on like the United States end. And then we have this photo of her where she's not looking at the camera, but it's great to have this information too on her visa application. So now we're going to talk about some other USCIS records. So there's something called a registry file. I don't know if you guys have ever seen something called a certificate of arrival. Those were issued after 1906 for individuals applying for naturalization. It was basically a formal means to show that individuals met the residency requirements for arriving in the United States. So you often see a certificate file with someone's petition for naturalization. So basically what would happen is someone would say, I think I arrived in the United States at the Port of New York on like May 15th, 1909 on a ship called this name. You would write a letter to the Port of New York. Port of New York would say, okay, I find your name. So here's a certificate proving your arrival, or I can't find your name. But you wanted them to find your name, so you could include that with your naturalization documentation. It wasn't until 1929 that the government said, you know, we do have an issue. Not everyone is able to prove when they arrived in the United States. So then the government would create something called a registry file for them, which would be a file that would have information to substantiate their arrival in the United States. So it might be, you know, if they had a ticket for when they arrived in the United States to prove that I've been here for so many years. And that's something that you can request from USCIS, but it's a type of thing you have to do that index search request to get an R number. And again, this could be something consolidated in these mystical A files or C files that are consolidated. So again, you want to search for that index with USCIS for that R number. The only way to get the R number is to search for this. If you're not finding a certificate of arrival in someone's petition for naturalization during that time, sometimes an R number might be like present on the petition. So, and it would be the right one. It's not like the visa file number where it's not. And then you can record a request with a case ID if you already have that number and got it from the index search request. So now A files. So from April 1944 onward, A files are maintained for immigrants who had not naturalized or arrived in the United States at this time. So if someone did naturalize between April 1944 to April 1956, their record should be in something called a consolidated C file. So that could be that their visa file number, their alien registration form, all of that is going to be in the C file along with that certificate of naturalization that we talked about earlier. So if someone was not a citizen in 1940, but naturalized before April 1944, they're not going to have an A file, but they will have an A number, and you can possibly get their alien registration form through the National Archives. So A numbers for 1944 or 1940 to 1955, you could use the National Archives online immigrants for people who arrived during this time who were not naturalized at some point. And from 1956 on, A numbers are procured using a FOIA request via USCIS unless you are the immigrant yourself. Now you'll also see this, I know this is complicated, but if an A number is below 8 million, it might be requested by USCIS if someone arrived between 1944 to 1951. If it's below 8 million, it can also be requested via the National Archives if the immigrant is over 100 years old, and that's because these records are sent to the National Archives from USCIS if the immigrant would be over 100 years old. Now, if an A number is above 8 million, it can be requested via USCIS FOIA, and there's instructions on how to do this in your handout, or you could Google USCIS FOIA if the individual is deceased or you have their permission. So what does that mean? That means if someone came to the United States, say in 1978, they probably have an A number, and they could FOIA their records from USCIS to see what the government has on them, or if someone came to this country and they're deceased and you provide proof of their death and they were an immigrant who came after 1956, you can also FOIA their records. But again, it takes a long time. So I know these immigration records are complicated to follow, but I hope I did a sufficient job of at least putting this stuff on your radar. So I want you to all utilize your handout and the flow charts to try to identify records for your immigrant ancestors. And as I mentioned, weeks can really be spent learning the ins and outs of these record groups. But I want to give you a basic knowledge of what is out there to start requesting these records and utilizing them, just so you know what is available. because there's so much, and like there's could be like really a treasure trove of meaningful information for these immigrant ancestors. But if we don't know what's out there, we can't explore it. And with that, I'm happy to answer any questions before we take a break and go into our activity. Thank you, guys. Yeah.
Repeat the question for the.
Okay, yeah, of course.
Please.
If an American man and woman, can you repeat the question for me? Since she was Canadian and then he was a US citizen beforehand, I think she would have had to naturalize. That's something that I have to like even look on, because that's like a rare question. Because usually if he naturalized, she would have gotten derivative citizenship from that. But I think she would have had to naturalize at that time. Yeah, no, there's like so many caveats. Sometimes I have to look at it, but it's a great, yeah. Yeah.
Other questions?
Yeah. There was not, because since it was like the colonies, it was
ahead,
different.
repeat.
Oh yeah, prior to independence, was there a requirement for non-UK citizens to naturalize in the US? No, there wasn't, because it was just the colonies, is my understanding. Yes. The question is, what percentage of first generation immigrants actually became US citizens? I feel like it really depends on the time. I think most people did become US citizens, but I find like rural individuals who might have been like laborers, like coal miners or worked in steel mills, and they're from Eastern Europe and they didn't speak the language well, they were later to naturalize. I feel like even though you didn't have to be a US citizen to have a social security number, I think people wanted to become US citizens after social security was a thing in 1937. So you see a push in like the early 1940s with like World War II and everything for people to naturalize. But before that time, I feel like it's murkier for that population. But in early records, I feel like most people did naturalize. Yeah.
Okay.
Okay.
We're going to take about more than 5, less than 10 minutes. If you can get back and we can get started in less than 10 minutes, that's fine, but at least a 5-minute break for people to take care of necessary things. So I will share with you one little reminder that this came to me. I have a friend who went over to France and married a Frenchman, and that was lovely. And he's a citizen, she's a citizen now, but she went for a real ID, the new Virginia documentation or driver's license. And they said, this marriage certificate is in French. Well, duh, it was done in France. And they said, we can't accept it if it's done in French because it needs to be sent to our special translation department. So if by some chance you or a friend are busy trying to get a real ID and don't have one yet, make sure your documents are all in English or start early. Anyway, with that in mind, take 5 minutes. If we can get started a little more quickly than that, we will. And thank you very much. Okay, and let me just, before the recording started, we talked about how small the print is on some of the handouts, and we were pointing out it's a zoomable file. However you use whatever kind of computer you have, you can zoom in on it or zoom out if you really want to, and read it more carefully. And now I'm going to get out of the way and you'll need to switch what file you're sharing.
Yep.
But you seem to be able to do that pretty quickly. So you'll need to go here and do a stop share.
Oh.
And now you're going to need to do a share again.
Okay.
That's the word stop.
Okay, so for the workshop, I want you guys to get into groups of 4 to 5. We're going to attempt to use these flowcharts. I apologize for the print being so small, but I'm trying to cram a lot of information. I want you to have like one scribe in your groups of 4 to 5, and I'm going to pass out the larger versions of the flowcharts. And using the flowcharts and what you learned in the lecture, I'm going to have you guys answer in groups some case study questions that'll be up on this screen. And then we're going to discuss the answers to the questions, and then we can discuss any other immigration related questions that you might have with any time remaining, although I know we're a little pressed for time right now. So these are the questions. Can you guys see this? I know we were supposed to have printed out copies and don't, so I put them on this. If not, I can do them in chunks of 3 so it's bigger. Would that be easier? Okay, I'll do that now. Okay. Yes. And we're going to start just spending a few minutes trying to answer these questions using the passenger list flowchart and what you learned on the screen. Yeah, then we'll just probably do USCIS, the national. Any other one. Yeah, that's what I. Okay, that's great. Yeah. Yeah.
Even, you know, go to the sun.
No, we can just.
Well, then that's probably. Just stick with this, and then you can question.
Yeah.
Question. And we'll wrap up. Oh. What?
Yeah. Yeah. Because we go and now it's like a law.
I think you can.
Yeah.